The Return of the Native is Thomas Hardy's sixth published novel. It first appeared in the magazine Belgravia, a publication known for its sensationalism, and was presented in 12 monthly installments from January to December 1878. Because of the novel's controversial themes, Hardy had some difficulty finding a publisher. Reviews, however, though somewhat mixed, were generally positive. In the 20th century, The Return of the Native became one of Hardy's most popular and highly regarded novels. Thomas Hardy Ohm, 2 June 1840–11 January 1928, was an English novelist and poet. A Victorian realist in the tradition of George Eliot, he was influenced both in his novels and in his poetry by Romanticism, including the poetry of William Wordsworth. He was highly critical of Muchen Victorian society, especially on the declining status of rural people in Britain, such as those from his native southwest England. Summary. The novel takes place entirely in the environs of Egdon Heath, and, with the exception of the epilogue, Aftercourses, covers exactly a year and a day. The narrative begins on the evening of Guy Fawkes' night as Diggory Venn is slowly crossing the heath with his van, which is being drawn by ponies. In his van is a passenger. When darkness falls, the country folk light bonfires on the surrounding hills, emphasizing the pagan spirit of the heath and its denizens. Venn is a reddleman. He travels the country supplying farmers with a red mineral called reddle, dialect term for red ochre that farmers use to mark their sheep. Although his trade has stained him red from head to foot, underneath his devilish coloring he is a handsome, shrewd, well-meaning young man. His passenger is a young woman named Thomasin Yawbright, whom Venn is taking home. Earlier that day, Thomasin had planned to marry Damon Wildev, a local innkeeper known for his fickleness. However, an inconsistency in the marriage license delayed the marriage. Thomasin, in distress, ran after the Reddleman's van and asked him to take her home. Venn himself is in love with Thomasin, and unsuccessfully wooed her 2 years before. Now, although he believes Wildev is unworthy of her love, he is so devoted to her that he is willing to help her secure the man of her choice. At length, Venn reaches Bloom's End, the home of Thomasin's aunt, Mrs. Yawbright. She is a good woman, if somewhat proud and inflexible, and she wants the best for Thomasin. In former months she opposed her niece's choice of husband, and publicly forbade the banns. Now, since Thomasin has compromised herself by leaving town with Wildev and returning unmarried, the best outcome Mrs. Yawbright can envision is for the postponed marriage to be duly solemnized as soon as possible. She and Venn both begin working on Wildev to make sure he keeps his promise to Thomasin. Wildev, however, is still preoccupied with Eustacia Vi, an exotically beautiful young woman living with her grandfather in a lonely house on Egdon Heath. Eustacia is a black-haired, queenly woman, whose Italian father came from Corfu, and who grew up in Budmouth, a fashionable seaside resort. She holds herself aloof from most of the Heath folk. They, in turn, consider her an oddity, and some even think she's a witch. She is nothing like Thomasin, who is sweet-natured. She loathes the Heath, yet roams it constantly, carrying a spyglass and an hourglass. The previous year, she and Wildev were lovers. However, even during the height of her passion for him, she knew she only loved him because there was no better object available. When Wildev broke off the relationship to court Thomasin, Eustacia's interest in him briefly returned. The two meet on Guy Fawkes' night, and Wildev asks her to run off to America with him. She demurs. Eustacia drops Wildev when Mrs. Yawbright's son Clem, a successful diamond merchant, returns from Paris to his native Egdon Heath. Although he has no plans to return to Paris or the diamond trade and is, in fact, planning to become a schoolmaster for the rural poor, Eustacia sees him as a way to escape the hated Heath and begin a grander, richer existence in a glamorous new location. With some difficulty, she arranges to meet Clem, and the two soon fall in love. When Mrs. Yawbright objects, Clem quarrels with her. Later, she quarrels with Eustacia as well. When he sees that Eustacia is lost to him, Wildev marries Thomasin, who gives birth to a daughter the next summer. Clem and Eustacia also marry and move to a small cottage 5 miles away, where they enjoy a brief period of happiness. The seeds of rancor soon begin to germinate. However, Clem studies night and day to prepare for his new career as a schoolmaster while Eustacia clings to the hope that he'll give up the idea and take her abroad. Instead, he nearly blinds himself with too much reading, then further mortifies his wife by deciding to eke out a living, at least temporarily, as a furs cutter. Eustacia, her dreams blasted, finds herself living in a hut on the heath, chained by marriage to a lowly laboring man. At this point, Wildev reappears. He has unexpectedly inherited a large sum of money, and is now in a better position to fulfill Eustacia's hopes. He comes calling on the Jobrites in the middle of one hot August day and, although Klim is at home, he is fast asleep on the hearth after a grueling session of furs cutting. While Eustacia and Wildev are talking, Mrs. Jobrite knocks on the door. She has decided to pay a courtesy call in the hopes of healing the estrangement between herself and her son. Eustacia looks out at her and then, in some alarm, ushers her visitor out at the back door. She hears Klim calling to his mother and, thinking his mother's knocking has awakened him, remains in the garden for a few moments. When Eustacia goes back inside, she finds Klim still asleep and his mother gone. Klim, she now realizes, merely cried out his mother's name in his sleep. Mrs. Jobrite, it turns out, saw Eustacia looking out the window at her. She also saw Klim's gear by the door, and so knew they were both at home. Now, thinking she has been deliberately barred from her son's home, she miserably begins the long, hot walk home. Later that evening, Klim, unaware of her attempted visit, heads for Bloom's End and on the way finds her crumpled beside the path, dying from an adder's bite. When she expires that night from the combined effects of snake venom and heat exhaustion, Klim's grief and remorse make him physically ill for several weeks. Eustacia, racked with guilt, dares not tell him of her role in the tragedy. When he eventually finds out from a neighbor's child about his mother's visit, and Wildev's, he rushes home to accuse his wife of murder and adultery. Eustacia refuses to explain her actions. Instead, she tells him "You are no blessing, my husband," and reproaches him for his cruelty. She then moves back to her grandfather's house, where she struggles with her despair while she awaits some word from Klim. Wildev visits her again on Guy Fawkes night, and offers to help her get to Paris. Eustacia realizes that if she lets Wildev help her, she'll be obliged to become his mistress. She tells him she will send him a signal by night if she decides to accept. Klim's anger, meanwhile, has cooled and he sends Eustacia a letter the next day offering reconciliation. The letter arrives a few minutes too late. By the time her grandfather tries to give it to her, she has already signaled to Wildev and set off through wind and rain to meet him. She walks along weeping, however, knowing she is about to break her marriage vows for a man who is unworthy of her. Wildev readies a horse and gig and waits for Eustacia in the dark. Thomasin, guessing his plans, sends Klim to intercept him. She also, by chance, encounters Diggory Ven as she dashes across the heath herself in pursuit of her husband. Eustacia does not appear. Instead, she falls or throws herself into nearby Shadwater Weir. Klim and Wildev hear the splash and hurry to investigate. Wildev plunges recklessly after Eustacia without bothering to remove his coat, while Klim, proceeding more cautiously, nevertheless is also soon at the mercy of the raging waters. Ven arrives in time to save Klim, but is too late for the others. When Klim revives, he accuses himself of murdering his wife and mother. In the epilogue, Ven gives up being a reddleman to become a dairy farmer. 2 years later, Thomasin marries him and they settle down happily together. Klim, now a sad, solitary figure, eventually takes up preaching. Alternative ending. In a footnote towards the end of the novel in some compendium editions, Hardy writes, "The writer may state here that the original conception of the story did not design a marriage between Thomasin and Ven. He was to have retained his isolated and weird character to the last. Thomasin remaining a widow, but certain circumstances of serial publication led to a change of intent. Readers can therefore choose between the endings, and those with an austere artistic code can assume the more consistent conclusion to be the true one." With its deeply flawed heroine and its for the time open acknowledgement of illicit sexual relationships, The Return of the Native raised some eyebrows when it first appeared as a serial in Victorian Britain. Although he intended to structure the novel into 5 books, thus mirroring the classical tragic format, Hardy submitted to the tastes of the serial reading public sufficiently to tack on a happy ending for Diggory Ven and Thomasin in a 6th book, Aftercourses. In Hardy's original conception, Ven retains his weird reddleman's character, while Thomasin lives out her days as a widow. Hardy's choice of themes. sexual politics, thwarted desire, and the conflicting demands of nature and society, makes this a truly modern novel. Underlying these modern themes, however, is a classical sense of tragedy. Hardy scrupulously observes the three unities of time, place, and action and suggests that the struggles of those trying to escape their destinies will only hasten their destruction. To emphasize this main part he uses a setting in ancient Heath steeped in pre-Christian history and supplies a chorus consisting of Grandfer Cantle, Timothy Fairway, and the rest of the Heath folk. Eustacia, who manipulates fate in hopes of leaving Egdon Heath for a larger existence in Paris, instead becomes an eternal resident when she drowns in Shadwater Weir. Wildev shares not only Eustacia's dream of escape, but also her fate, and Clym, the wood. B. Educational reformer, survives the Weir but lives on as a lonely, remorseful man. Some critics, notably D.H. Lawrence, see the novel as a study of the way communities control their misfits. In Egdon Heath, most people, particularly the women, look askance at the proud, unconventional Eustacia. Mrs. Yawbright considers her too odd and unreliable to be a suitable bride for her son, and Susan Nunsick, who frankly believes her to be a witch, tries to protect her children from Eustacia's supposedly baleful influence by stabbing her with a stocking pin and later burning her in effigy. Clym at first laughs at such superstitions, but later embraces the majority opinion when he rejects his wife as a murderer and adulteress. In this view, Eustacia dies because she has internalized the community's values to the extent that, unable to escape Egdon without confirming her status as a fallen woman, she chooses suicide. She thereby ends her sorrows while at the same time, by drowning in the Weir like any woman instead of floating, witch-like, she proves her essential innocence to the community. Clement Clym Yawbright, a man of about 30 who gives up a business career in Paris to return to his native Egdon Heath to become a schoolmaster to the poor and ignorant. Hardy himself gave up a successful career as a London architect and returned to his native Dorchester to become a writer. The beauty here visible would in no time be ruthlessly overrun by its parasite, thought. Clym is the native, to which the book's title refers. Eustacia Vi, a raven-haired young beauty who chafes against her life on the heath and longs to escape it to lead the more adventure-filled life of the world. Some of the heath folk think she is a witch. Hardy describes her as the raw material of a divinity, whose celestial imperiousness, love, wrath, and fervor had proved to be somewhat thrown away on Netherward Egdon. Mrs. Yawbright, Clym's mother, a widow of inflexible standards. Thomasin has lived with her for many years, but Clym is her only child. She strongly disapproves of Eustacia. Thomasin Tamsin Yawbright, Clym's cousin and Mrs. Yawbright's niece, a young girl of gentle ways and conventional expectations. In Hardy's original manuscript, Wildev tricks her with a false marriage to seduce her. Mrs. Yawbright saw a little figure, undefended except by the power of her own hope. Damon Wildev, Eustacia's former lover and Thomasin's first husband. He is an ex-engineer who has failed in his profession and who now keeps an inn, the Quiet Woman, so called because its sign depicts a decapitated woman carrying her own head. He has a wandering eye and an appetite for women. A lady-killing career. Diggory Venn, a resourceful man of 24 and a Reddleman, a traveling seller of Reddle. Red chalk used for marking sheep. He selflessly protects Thomasin throughout the novel despite the fact that she refused to marry him 2 years before. He keeps a watchful eye on Eustacia to make sure Wildev doesn't go back to her. At the end, he renounces his trade to become a dairy farmer like his father, and in doing so loses the red skin. He is then seen as a suitable husband for Thomasin. Venn's red coloration and frequent narrative references to his Mephistopheline, or diabolical character are symbolic and important. In one particularly significant chapter, the morning and evening of an eventful day, Venn displays an increasingly unlikely string of good luck, repeatedly rolling dice and defeating a rival. This event makes Venn something of a deus ex machina, as well as a quasi-magical figure. While Hardy abandons these aspects of Venn's character by the end of the novel, during his Reddleman phase, Venn lends elements of magical realism and what modern readers would understand to be superheroic elements to the novel. Captain Drew, Eustacia's grandfather and a former naval officer, renamed Captain Vi in later editions. Timothy Fairway, a sententious man of middle age who is greatly respected by the other heath folk. Grandfer Cantle, a somewhat senile and always lively ex-soldier of about 69. Christian Cantle, Grandfer Cantle's fearful and timid 31-year-old son. Humphrey, Clem's eventual colleague, a furze cutter. Furze is a low, prickly shrub more commonly called gorse. Susan Nunsick, Eustachia's nearest neighbor and bitterest enemy, who convinces herself that Eustachia's witchery has caused her son's sickliness. In a memorable scene, Susan tries to protect him by making a wax effigy of Eustachia, sticking it full of pins, and melting it in her fireplace while uttering the Lord's Prayer backward. Eustachia drowns later that night. Johnny Nunsick, Susan's son, a young boy. He encounters Mrs. Yobwright during her fatal walk home and, in obedience to her wishes, reports her last words to Clem: "I am a broken-hearted woman cast off by my son." Charlie, a 16-year-old boy who works for Captain Drew and who admires Eustachia, largely from afar. Egdon Heath, the setting for all the novel's events, considered by some critics to be the leading character as well. 6. It is profoundly ancient, the scene of intense but long-forgotten pagan lives. As its tumuli attest, it is also a graveyard that has swallowed countless generations of inhabitants without changing much itself. To Thomason, Clem, and Diggory, it is a benign, natural place. In Eustachia's eyes, it becomes a malevolent presence intent on